I'm joined now by a Republican in Congress, Senator Tim Scott. Good morning, Senator. And Senator, let's take a look at what President Trump said about Roy Moore earlier this week.
We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat. Jones, I've looked at his record.
Is an accused child molester better than a Democrat? Is an accused
Well, he
child
denies
molester
it.
better
Look,
than
he
a
denies it. He says it didn't happen. And, you know, you have to listen to him also. You're talking about, he said 40 years ago this did not happen. Roy Moore denies it. That's all I can say. He denies it. And by the way, he totally denies it.
And the president tweeting just moments ago, doubling down on this, saying, quote, the last thing we need in Alabama and the U.S. Senate is a Schumer-Pelosi puppet who is weak on crime, weak on the border, and saying Jones would be a disaster. So, Senator, you've said that it's in the best interest of the country that Roy Moore find something else to do rather than run for Senate. But you saw the president's take on Moore. You've listened to Moore. Has the Alabama Republican said anything recently that has made you change your mind?
No, ma'am. It is pretty clear to me that the best thing that Roy Moore could do for the country is to move on. The reality of it is that the allegations are still very strong and credible, and the denial has been weak, gotten a little stronger, but it's still fairly weak. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of many Republicans and conservatives in the Senate, it is time for us to turn the page, because it is not about partisan politics. It's not about electing Republicans versus Democrats. This is about the character of our country. I want to be on the side of right when history writes the story.
So is President Trump on the side of wrong?
Well, the president will have to make his own decisions on where he thinks he is and why he's there. Partisan politics is very important in Washington. It's how you get your job done on either side of the aisle. From my perspective, I'm not taking it from a Republican perspective or a Democrat perspective. I'm thinking about those folks who have been negatively impacted by these allegations. I'm thinking about the long-term health of the country from a personal perspective that leads me to one conclusion. I've been there, I'm staying there, and I am looking for ways for us to heal this devastating wound in our country. I think Peggy Noonan said it really well over the weekend. It is time for sunshine to hit this offensive behavior and for us to clean up this act.
Well, let's go back to President Trump. Jeff Flake said that the president made a big mistake supporting Roy Moore. Do you agree it's a mistake for President Trump to do this?
I really can't say what the president should or should not do. I will tell you that the judge and the jury in this case will be the voters of Alabama, and they will weigh in very soon. About 2 weeks and a couple of days from now, we'll hear the outcome of the voters who will be the judge and the jury for this case as it relates to Roy Moore.
But I want to stay with President Trump, who certainly sets a tone. In the aftermath of Charlottesville and the president's response, you said his moral authority was compromised. Is his moral authority compromised because of these comments about Roy Moore?
Well, there's certainly, I don't think so. I think the reality of it is that while I have read through as many stories as I could get my hands on, I think the issue in the case is compelling. I have reached the conclusion. I think there are many Americans who disagree with me vehemently. I don't necessarily understand how, but they do. I look forward to addressing and following this issue as long as we can. We'll know more about the outcome of this election on, I think it's December the 12th. So when Americans disagree with me, whether that's the president or other folks, it doesn't change my opinion, but I'm certainly unable to change theirs.
Okay, the New York Times piece also says that the president not only doubts Roy Moore's accusers, but has been telling people he now doubts the authenticity of the Access Hollywood tape. Here's a quote from the Times. He sees the calls for Mr. Moore to step aside as a version of the response to the now famous Access Hollywood tape, in which he boasted about grabbing women's genitalia and the flood of groping accusations against him that followed soon after. He suggested to a senator earlier this year that it was not authentic and repeated that claim to an advisor more recently. Your reaction, do you believe the Access Hollywood tape is authentic?
Well, I'll tell you what I do believe. Number one, I believe that the voters of this country had the information before the election of 2016. They had a choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They chose Donald Trump with all of the evidence and all the information before them. Number two, I think we have to be very careful not to try to make this into a partisan issue when those who are liberal want to fight those who are conservative, and where those who are conservative want to fight liberals on the issue. I think the issue that we should focus on is that sexual harassment is an offense that is so deplorable, so disgusting, that we as a country need to fight against it tooth and nail with everything we have. Ultimately, the voters will be the decision makers in some of the cases, but we as a nation, whether you're in politics, media, sports, we have to tackle this issue, and we have not done a good job of it so far.
Well, let's talk about this. The president said he'll wait until this week to decide whether he goes to campaign for Roy Moore. What kind of signal do you think that would send women if he does?
Well, I think the president will have to make the decision on whether or not he thinks that the risk, the benefit outweighs the risk. In this case, from my perspective, I have made my decision, and you won't find me in Alabama.
Okay, I want to move on to the NFL. President Trump once again tweeted angrily while at Mar-a-Lago this Thanksgiving week. He began by continuing his criticism of LeVar Ball, the father of one of the UCLA players who was arrested for shoplifting in China and later freed. He said, LeVar, you could have spent the next 5 to 10 years during Thanksgiving with your son in China, but no NBA contract to support you. But remember, LeVar, shoplifting is not a little thing. It's a really big deal, especially in China. Ungrateful fool. That tweet was followed by this. The NFL is now thinking about a new idea, keeping teams in the locker room during the national anthem next season. That's almost as bad as kneeling. When will the highly paid commissioner finally get tough and smart? The issue is killing your league. And Washington Post opinion writer Greg Sargent said the president's tweets are part of a larger trend, writing, Trump's rage tweets about LeVar Ball are part of a pattern. Trump regularly attacks high-profile African Americans to feed his supporters' belief that the system is rigged for minorities. Do you think the president has a habit of unnecessarily singling out minorities?
There certainly is. The president is a good counterpuncher. He doesn't seem to discriminate from my perspective. I think he attacks anyone he believes or perceives as attacking him or the country, whether it's right or wrong. I will say, as it relates to the LeVar Ball incident, as it relates to China, I think there's a segment on ESPN called Come On, Man. Here's my thought. If you're going to steal, and you're going to steal in China, and someone gets you out of that, you ought to say thank you. They should say welcome. The reality of it is, for a high-profile athlete to go to China and steal, and then the President of the United States, who obviously has a very precarious and provocative relationship with sports completely, to bail you out, I think deserves a thank you without having to be asked for it. So the truth of the matter is,
not singling out minorities. You don't think he's singling out minorities? From the UCLA players to NFL players?
I will tell you that from my perspective, the answer is no. There is no doubt that if he were singling out minorities in the basketball situation, he singled them out in a positive way. The reality of it is, having the President of the United States step in to help you out when you're in China, that is a powerful move that likely brought those fellows home without having to miss Thanksgiving with their family, because the truth is there could have been some really negative consequences to those young folks.
Okay, Senator, I want to move on. This holiday week, when we're all giving thanks and we think of those less fortunate than us, I wanted to talk about poverty and income inequality. Your background,
yes,
raised by a single mother in a low-income home, you said that the Republican tax bill will help the poor. How?
Couple of ways that we do that. Number one, if you look at on the personal income side, there was about $1.370 trillion of personal income taxes paid in 2014, 2015. Out of that amount, the folks on the lower end received about $2.4 billion in refunds. In other words, they did not pay any actual tax in the aggregate. Our plan increases that refund by about 40%. We also increased the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. We continue to work for areas. Deb Fischer, a senator from Nebraska, has led the charge on family leave, providing a tax credit for family leave, which is included in our legislation. I have included in the tax reform legislation the Investing in Opportunity Act, which targets 50 million Americans living in poverty and distressed communities, bringing back over $2 trillion of capital gains back into those communities long term to solve some of the serious problems that are endemic in some of the communities where I grew up.
Okay, but about 45% of Americans don't pay income tax, and many of those are the working poor. So how does it help them?
Well, if you don't pay income taxes and we increase your refund by 40%, that is a direct dollar impact. In other words, you'll have more money to use to keep those ends together. Those single mothers like mine who are working paycheck to paycheck, they will now not get a $9,300 deduction. We're doubling that deduction almost to $18,000 for a dual parent household. Income household, we're going from around $12,700 for the standard deduction to around $24,000. What we focused on is making sure that those folks who are struggling to get ahead in life have more of their own money so that they can take care of the needs of their families and perhaps even have a night out.
And you see a bill passing by Christmas?
Well, I do believe in prayer, number one, and I hope that we get it done by Christmas. If not, we'll be here through Christmas looking at the end of the year so that we can make sure that we provide tax relief for those working families like the one I grew up in.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us, Senator Scott.
Yes, ma'am. Have a good day.
You too.